Hello everyone. Quiz question. What is the most spoken language that is not one of the official native languages of Ireland? The answer is Polish. So I decided I would do an episode today on the connections between Ireland and Poland. You might think that they started in 2004 when Poland joined the EU and Ireland was one of 3 countries to allow Polish citizens straight into the Irish workforce from the very beginning. But no, it actually goes back roughly 3,500 years before Christ, or BC. Neolithic Ireland, which was about 10,000 BC, played host at some point to a woman who has become known in modern parlance as the Ballinahattie woman because she was buried in Ballinahattie, Northern Ireland. She had dark hair and dark eyes, probably brown, and was believed at the time of her finding to be the basis for what the Irish people were, essentially. However, fast forward to 2016 and a paper was released detailing the finding of 3 bodies in Rathlin Island, Northern Ireland. These 3 bodies were of 3 men who were, shockingly, not Middle Eastern, but Pontic. So they came from the Pontic steppe of what is now a bit of Russia, Ukraine, and today's country, Poland. And if you look around, there is other examples at the same time of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales particularly reflect this connection to the Polish or Ukrainian genetic makeup, or what I would call the Pontic makeup. The chief example of this is hemochromatosis, which is a disease, but that essentially increases iron production or absorption within the body. However, if you think about it, they were coming from the Pontic steppe, which is a place where it would have been hard to get iron-rich foods. So to have hemochromatosis disease, in inverted commas, would have been extremely useful for the people because they had to use as much of the iron as they could. However, with our now fortified diets and every sort of a thing you can have, the hemochromatosis has turned from an advantage to a disadvantage. And that is only one of a number of elements, including blue eyes, by the way, that shows that we had connections to the humans of the Pontic steppe about 4 or 5,000 years ago. If you remember from my last episode, you will have heard that Ireland has long-standing continental connections via trade. Spoiler alert here, Bohemia, which is modern-day Germany and a little bit of other countries around, actually comes from the word Boii, B-O-I-I, which was the name for a Celtic tribe. So you might think of the Celts as French, Irish, maybe Welsh. But actually, the Celtic world stretched all the way from Ireland to Eastern Europe, including Poland. And the road stretched in both directions, and the road became a literal road for trade. Every so often, archaeologists will dig up hill fort graves. Every so often, within those graves that are around 5,000 years old, they will find amber. Now, you don't get amber commonly in Ireland. But where you do get amber very commonly is the Baltic region, which includes Poland. And you also get it scattered throughout Europe. But all of the amber, or a lot of it, that you find scattered throughout Europe is actually Baltic in origin. So basically, amber beads become Bronze Age receipts proving cross-continental connections the entire way from Ireland to Poland and back. And of course, it is not just gifts or physical things. Also, language. The city of, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, Legnica in Poland actually comes from the Celtic word for fortress. And if you visit Poland, you can find there a lake in a place called Kujawia. This lake is actually an archaeological site known as a ritual lake, common throughout the UK and also somewhat common in Ireland, where the Celts essentially just threw in swords, shields, money, any sort of item that they could in order to please their gods. So you might think of Ireland as a isolated outpost in the Atlantic Ocean, a wet rock, essentially. But no, Ireland actually had connections to the Pontic steppe all the way across the far side of the continent in Poland, and vice versa, as we will get to later. Speaking of later, I should have read my notes better. Wawel Cathedral Library, Poland. You're flicking through books, and suddenly you see something that looks very familiar. You see something that you have heard mentioned in the previous episode of the History and Heritage podcast. Celtic designs, similar to the Book of Kells, but before the Book of Kells. These designs are in a Polish book. And these designs are evidence that both art and people moved from Ireland to Poland in the 8th century AD. Unfortunately, because I'm doing literally just Ireland and Poland connections, we have to jump. So we've jumped from 3000 to 1500 BC, then to the 8th century AD, and now to the 17th century AD, because that's just what happens when you're getting connections. 1610, 17th century AD. Battle of Klusino, where Sweden fought against Poland. There were many Irish mercenaries living in Sweden. Essentially, what happened was, after the Flight of the Earls, which I can do an episode on if you like, the Irish went to Europe and looked and saw where the best and biggest armies were. They picked places like France, Spain, and Sweden. However, the Swedes decided to pick a fight with the Poles. And the Swedes were Protestant, and the Poles were Catholic, and the Irish were Catholic. So they saw what was going on, they being the Irish, and 1,200 of them decided, yeah, Sweden, no, I don't like you anymore. So I'm going to switch. And during the Battle of Klusino, those 1,200 Irish mercenaries swapped sides, had started fighting for the Swedes, but swapped and then started fighting for the Polish. And this was not actually the start, as I've told previously, but the biggest modern day, to an extent, example of mass migration that started in Ireland and ended up in Poland. Around the same time, about 20 to 30 years later, you come across a name that is apparently very famous in Poland. That name is Bernard O'Connor. That man is a doctor. That man was in the court of King Jan Sobieski III. Again, I've messed up the pronunciations. But he wrote the first ever English language history of Poland. So if you were wondering what the Irish connection was, well, from the very beginning, the connections between Ireland and Poland were both martial, or relating to wars, and intellectual. It helped a lot that the Irish and the Poles were both Catholic, and they actually, if you look at it, liked very similar things and were very similar culturally, partially because, by the way, they were both under the watchful eye of Protestant neighbours. And this cultural and religious affinity mattered as much as money. So we've talked about an ancient migration from Poland to Ireland, more modern migration from Ireland to Poland. And now let's talk about the migration of ideas. Because both Poland and Ireland during the 1800s had decided essentially that they had enough of being dominated by neighbours. Unfortunately, some of the time the Polish early on failed. But this gave great ideas to the Irish. So, for example, in his trial in 1798, Wolfe Tone said, "I hoped to succeed where Kosciuszko, who is one of the rebels in Poland, had failed." And even in 1792, so 6 years earlier, the Polish constitution was written, and once Ireland got the news, there was a march in Belfast celebrating the writing of the Polish constitution. Around the same time, just a little tidbit for you, Ireland became known because of their shared struggles, their shared similar outlook on life, and literally their shared people in some cases, as the Poland of the seas. In the 18 and 1900s, you had two major Polish people who became very well-known figures in Ireland. You had Count Paul Strzelecki, who became Sir Paul Strzelecki after he came to Mayo and Sligo during the famine because he deep down empathised with the plight of the Irish due to his knowledge of what was happening in Poland, and he actually set up essentially a forerunner of breakfast clubs in Irish schools. So he actually fed the children in Irish schools out of his own pocket, taught them proper hygiene, and as a result saved tens of thousands of Irish. And of course, you can't talk about Poland and Ireland without talking about Constance Gore Booth, who married Casimir Markovich. Casimir came over in the early 1900s, looking to indulge himself in the Irish art scene, which was one of the biggest in the world at the time. He had come from what was Ukraine, but had lived quite a lot in Poland as well, and had seen the struggle of the Polish people. Once he came to Ireland, he realised that the Irish were fighting the exact same struggle on the other side of the continent. Mixing with the arty circles, he eventually met the very famous socialite, to use the word, Constance Gore Booth. Realised that she was also fighting for Irish freedom, and they married. He then set up an art school, and shortly after that, Constance Gore Booth, aka Constance Markovich, became famous as the radical politician influencing the 1916 Rising, urged on by her Polish husband, and then became, first woman elected, all that kind of things. 1933, Gdansk, Sean Lester, one of our first ever diplomats in Ireland after we sent our first consul in 1929. There were protests against Nazi actions in Gdansk, and Sean Lester, who was a diplomat in Poland from Ireland, went over and joined these protests. In the 1970s, once Poland had finally shaken off all the shackles of all the different difficulties that it had, the Irish Polish Society was set up, and by 1981, they spent over £250,000, which was a heck of a lot of money in the day, for 20 containers of food and other aid to relieve the Polish, who were struggling in much the same way as the Irish were during the famine and other times. And to close it all down, you come to 2004, the moment I mentioned earlier. As I said, the Polish is one of the most common languages in Ireland. In fact, in the 15 years after Poland joined the EU, there was 325,000 PPS numbers issued to Polish citizens. Trade went from 2004 levels of 300 million to now 7.4 billion. And a lot of that, funnily enough, is fueled by Irish whiskey, where Poland is the second largest market in the entire world. We're now getting to a point, actually, from my sources it seems so anyway, that some of the Polish are returning to Poland. But they are returning with, for example, a Dublin or Cork or Kerry accent. So you have Irishized, if that's the word, Gaelicized maybe, Poles coming back to Poland and changing the face of their own country, just like the Poles came to Ireland 4,500 years ago and changed the face of the Irish, quite literally. There has been a millennium, or actually millennia, of entanglements between Ireland and Poland. From Poland, Ireland has been influenced by genes, amber and famine. From Ireland, Poland has been influenced by its religion, its arts and trade, and both have been mutually influenced by revolution and literature. Migration, in a sense, you could see, is, in some form, when controlled, inevitable. Systems end up reconnecting, disconnecting, and reconnecting again. Migration is not, in this case, a one-way system. It is, in fact, a 5,000-year artery between Ireland and Poland. So next time you see a Polish person in Ireland, or next time, if you're listening to this from Poland, you see an Irish person in Poland, don't think to yourself, oh yes, this is from our great EU-driven relationship, because it could be 5,000 years older than that.